Have you ever heard the terms plot-driven and character-driven and wondered, what the heck does that mean? Well, let's find out. We're going to use the new Netflix show called Beef as an example in this week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week. By the way, this is a segment from the Carl King podcast, so if you enjoy this video, remember to like and subscribe and send us burritos. This week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week is Beef, Episode 1, screenwritten by Lee Sung-jin and directed by Hikari, starring Ali Wong and Steven Yeun. Beef's first episode is a perfect opportunity to talk about the difference between two types of stories, plot-driven and character-driven. And you can determine if a story is plot-driven or character-driven by asking the question, what causes the events to occur? What drives the story forward? And why is it all happening? Actually, those are three questions, aren't they? And we talk about plot, but what is plot or plotting? It's planning. It's charting a course or drawing a line on a map. We're starting here and we're going there. We're setting a destination in advance. It's premeditated. So in a plot-driven story, the focus is on a sequence of physical events. The writers plot out an adventure as if the characters are action figures. And the most important thing is to get them from here to there. And everything else is in support of that. In a plot-driven story, something called an inciting incident happens to the main character, which gives them a problem to solve. There's a clear, tangible goal, like rescue my daughter from the kidnappers, or rob the bank in order to pay off my gambling debts, or as simple as defeat the villain. The rest of the story is one attempt after another to achieve that single thing. It's as if the writers start with the beginning and the ending, and the scenes in between are only there because we need it to happen. So they can get from A to B to C to D, all the way to Z, and roll the credits. But there's a problem with this plot-driven method. Those things that happen in B, C, and D might not be plausible. So you'll often see characters doing things that make no sense and defying everyday human behavior, like ignoring obvious things in plain sight, making painfully bad choices that are out of character, stating facts out loud for the audience's sake, and even breaking the laws of physics. And that's what happens when writers paint themselves into a corner. The deadline arrives and, whoops, too bad, it's time to make the movie. But at least we got our characters from point A to point Z, and no one's going to notice, right? As long as the hero punches the bad guy and stops the end of the world, everyone's going to love it. But in his book called On Writing, Stephen King had this to say: I distrust plot for two reasons. First, because our lives are largely plotless, even when you add in all our reasonable precautions and careful planning. And second, because I believe plotting and the spontaneity of real creation aren't compatible. It's best that I be as clear about this as I can. I want you to understand that my basic belief about the making of stories is that they pretty much make themselves. The job of the writer is to give them a place to grow, and to transcribe them, of course. Plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first choice. The story which results from it is apt to feel artificial and labored. And as a plot denier myself, I think Carl King agrees with Stephen King. So that brings us back to Beef, which is a character-driven story. Everything that happens, everything that drives the story forward, is motivated by internal psychology. The people we're watching and learning about are not serving a plot. There's no lane or track. that their behavior is forced onto, like those little cars at Disneyland where you can move the steering wheel back and forth, but you're still stuck on a guided rail. There are no cartoony bad guys and good guys. There's no chaotic evil villain who only does chaotic evil things. And there's no lawful good hero who only does lawful good things. We can see the positive and negative aspects in all of the characters. They lie and manipulate each other and themselves. But they do attempt to do what they think is the right thing under the circumstances. And much of it comes from their subconscious. And since everything sprouts from that somewhat chaotic human behavior, every scene unfolds in an unpredictable way. The script feels as if it's improvised by real humans. We discover their secrets, we see them struggle with moral ambiguity, and we follow them around as they act on their own individual impulses. So with every scene, their future changes, which means the possible structure of the plot changes. They don't know what's going to happen, and neither do we. It's like every scene serves as another inciting incident, but those inciting incidents emerge from within the characters themselves. Each character makes some bad choices, but those bad choices are grounded in the context of their own life experiences. So while we might not make those exact bad choices ourselves, they do make sense. It feels like what the character would really do in a situation. And since those choices don't need to support a predetermined plot, they're free to make them. And within reason, the characters could do anything according to their nature and not ruin the story, because the story is actually being written forward from scene to scene. And that creates a chain of causality from A to B to C. But if you retroactively try to create a chain of causality by writing the beginning and the ending first, and later you try to fill in the blanks, you probably end up with a bunch of non sequiturs and material that doesn't feel like it belongs. So as a writer, in each scene, you can ask yourself, would this really happen? And if not, you're probably forcing the character's behavior and often the laws of physics to fulfill the plot. But if your story is entirely character-driven, you could have a different problem. You might end up in a place where the story is hard to resolve. And episodes of Seinfeld can feel that way. The scenes might move from one to the next flawlessly, developing this premise, and then the episode might just end. And to me, that doesn't feel satisfying, but that's okay because most of the world disagrees with me. The main point is when writing a character-driven story, it might be a completely different script than you expected to write. And that could be a good thing because I suspect that's how my favorite films are written. Now, let's go through some of the character-driven moments in Beef, Episode 1. Number 1, Danny is at the store to return his hibachi grills for the third time, and instead of successfully returning them, he can't find his receipt, he's frustrated by a rude clerk, and he just gives up and decides to keep them. Number 2, because of that, Danny gets into his truck, and in a moment of intense anger, he almost punches his steering wheel, but he doesn't. And once again, holding in his unhappiness. And then, of course, the seatbelt is stuck when he's trying to put it on, and he's like, it's always effing something. And number 3, as he's backing out of the parking spot, not looking at all where he's going, he is honked at aggressively by a BMW. The BMW pulls forward and flips him off. And the adventure begins. Now, that's our inciting incident, and it's entirely character-driven. There's no overall plot set up by this scene. There's no implied ending. He doesn't need to get home for Christmas. He doesn't need to solve a murder. Doesn't need to deliver a briefcase. He doesn't even know what he's doing. And he hasn't even thought it through. It's just plain old road rage after a bad day. So what plot could there possibly be here? And after that scene ends, at about 5 minutes in, we have the title card with the Werner Herzog quote. And for quite a while, there's no plot. It's entirely people interacting. Characters are introduced. We learn who they are, what they're unhappy about, and what they generally want out of life. On the surface, Danny and Amy both crave something similar. Danny wants to build a big house for his parents, and Amy wants to sell her business to spend more time with her family. And those are nice goals, but they're secondary. They're not the actual story here. Those are in the background. The actual story is the conflict and relationship between Danny and Amy. And if those two characters aren't going to interact again, the show would be pointless. And it's not until 28 minutes into the episode that Danny takes action related to that conflict. He finally looks up Amy's address using her license plate number, and he goes to her house, pretends to be helping her with some contracting work, and then he urinates all over her bathroom. And the episode ends with a great scene, Amy chasing Danny down the street. And that full episode is 36 and a half minutes. And there's very little plot. The majority of the story is character. And you could say, well, of course there's not much plot. It's only the first episode. It's establishing the characters and the backstory. But okay, for comparison, let's look at a plot-driven show like The Mandalorian. In episode 1, the main character goes on 2 plot-driven bounty hunting missions in a row. And until the final scene, we get no indication of anything internal driving him. It's just quest after quest. And everything that happens is related to moving those Star Wars action figures through the predetermined adventure. It's kind of a family show, so the characters have no depth or grown-up problems, and there's no internal conflict, no self-doubt, no neuroses. It's all physical and obvious and on the surface, and everyone's intentions are clearly stated through dialogue. They're not concerned with the internal. It's as if the show is written by kids playing with toys, unaware that adults develop a deeper level of psychological complexity. It seems like the deepest we get to see into Din Djarin is in the final scene when he doesn't kill Baby Yoda. And the series is now 3 seasons in, and it's still mission of the week, like a video game. Every episode, the hero flies to a planet to get something from a guy, but that guy sends him on a mission to defeat a foe. And next week, he repeats the same thing with a different planet, a different guy, and a different foe. And I can't think of a better example of something that is plot-driven. And at this point in my life, for my own totally subjective, personal, old man tastes, I want to believe a story's characters could be real people. And unfortunately, that is rare in plot-driven stories. And of course, stories can be some mixture of the two. But which do you prefer? Plot-driven or character-driven? If your answer is character-driven, I recommend Beef. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars and a little heart on Letterboxd. Okay, that's it for this week's Analytical Filmmaking Analysis of the Week. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, and send us burritos. And support the creation of more by joining my Patreon for $1, or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King.